We, the Center for Global Development, we're a group that try and see how we can make the international system that supports global development work more effectively.
How do we finance infrastructure in the poorest parts of the world? How do we increase productivity in agriculture? What kind of policy brings out the best outcomes?
What CGD is about is you can ask those difficult questions that people refuse to ask and actually find solutions.
We're thinking about how climate change will impact migration patterns, how that will in turn have impacts on people's health.
It's challenging to be able to align budget with ambitious programmatic goals, but it can be done.
If you can help to make things a little bit better, that's a good way to spend your time.
Welcome everybody to the Centre for Global Development, and particular welcome to our distinguished speaker, Lord Jeremy Purvis, who's the spokesperson for Foreign Affairs, International Development and Trade. And I think we'll be touching on all of those things in our conversation. So leaders are meeting at the moment in New York at the General Assembly. It's the halfway point for the Sustainable Development Goals. It's an important moment in the international calendar. And we're focused here on the UK's role, and I think it's clear that the UK has stepped back from its international development leadership role. But with an election coming up, there's potential for a future government to do things differently. And so we're having a series of discussions with political thought leaders, of which this is one, and asking what's wrong and what's right about UK development policy and what could change in future. So, for those of you watching online, you can ask questions on LinkedIn or on YouTube through the comments, or on Twitter through the hashtag CGD Talks. And we'll leave plenty of time for those questions and questions from the room at the end of our discussion. I'm also looking forward very much to hearing about the Liberal Democrats' policies and plans coming into conference. Before we get into that, I mean, I think it's always interesting to ask our guests, how did you get into development in the first place? What drew you to it? And then maybe we'll ask a little bit about the House of Lords as well. But welcome, thank you for being with us. And how did you first come to be interested in development?
Well, thank you, Ian, and thank you to the Centre for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be discussing these issues so timely, as you say, with hunger and the mid-stage point of the SDGs. I think as for my story, is probably quite common with many other Liberal Democrats who joined the party because of its international pedigree and heritage, and we are an internationalist party. I was a very precocious teenager and living in the Scottish borders, and I wanted to join a party that would change the world and get rid of Mrs. Thatcher at the point. So I joined, and then about 3 weeks later she did resign, so I peaked in my career rather early. But I went to a local association after I joined the party, and they said, great, you want to end world poverty, that's wonderful. On Saturday we have a litter pick on the local road, will you come and help us do litter picking? So perhaps my party has always been one that's looked global and international, but has been activists. And in my mind, as the spokesman, that combination of the two areas of being of always looking outwards, but also seeking practical solutions is at the heart of the thinking. I was really lucky when I was a student, and then after I graduated, I had an opportunity of working for David Steele in the 1990s, and in my kind of political formative years before I was elected to the Scottish Parliament and before I came into the House of Lords, I was able to see firsthand an internationalist, liberal politician as a practitioner. So that is all of his areas, and interest in liberalism in Asia, his work within Africa, way before I worked from chair of the anti-apartheid movement, and the work that he did as a liberal, I think, has never left me. So my journey has been kind of following for that. And since I've taken on this portfolio in the Lords, I've been lucky to think back to some of the heritage that I've had as a member of my party.
Very interesting. And we I think one of the issues for international development is how it connects to the public and how politics connects to the public more generally. So Could you just tell us a bit about how you came to be appointed into the House of Lords, and in practice, how do you decide how you spend your time? Is that determined by the party, by yourself? How does it all work?
So I didn't give £1 million to my party, but I was did 2 terms in the Scottish Parliament, and my former seat was chopped up in the Boundary Commission. And my Scottish Party was asking. We had an opportunity of having an appointee through Nick Clegg's time in coalition with David Cameron, and I was asked if I'd effectively be a Scottish Lib Dem in the Lords, and I was. And then my first few years there, I was very active in Scottish politics, leading up to and then after the Scottish referendum, and then at that stage, more of an interest on foreign affairs, and then as the international trade spokesman and then international development spokesman, I had the real privilege of supporting Michael Moore take through the 2015 Act. I was its sponsor in the House of Lords on the 0.7 Act, so it's been, and no doubt we're going to be talking about it in a moment, but that's been a personal tragedy to me to see how I was part of a consensus then in the Lords that it's been reduced to some extent by others. But as you can imagine, the House of Lords is an institution with no shortage of experience in foreign affairs and international development. So I was able to then rely on many of my colleagues and some of their experiences. And then more recently as the foreign affairs spokesman, to try and pool them together. I was very keen when I was appointed the spokesman to retain the trade and development portfolio, because in my mind, in our mind, there is the troika of the 3 areas are so interrelated that it makes sense to have thinking and present an approach on either on trade or on development or on certain aspects of foreign policy that we can make sure that there are strong links between the 3. Yeah,
very interesting. And I mean, you've been in post and following the UK's international development efforts, throughout the last probably 10 years and more. So I suppose focusing on, the last 5 years perhaps, and the government, what the government's done with the merger of the Foreign Office. I mean, you've called it a troika, the relationship between foreign affairs, development and trade. 2 of those are now in the same department. And of course, we've had the change to the aid budget. But stepping back from that 5-year period, how do you assess that 5 years, and what do you think the key issues are?
All 3 areas, I think they are complementary, but they are not the same. And this is where I think part of the challenge there's been over the last few years is when part of the government has been wanting to think that effectively development can be an arm of foreign policy. And I think that there are distinct areas and reasons why we, from the UK, that we have certain development policies and we have certain foreign policies and certain trade policies. And they are not to be, I don't think that they should be conflated. I think they can be complementary and they can support each other. But I think that's been one of the issues that I've had with the approach. I think where we were in 2015 at the end of the Liberal Conservative coalition was that there was a remarkable degree of consensus, political consensus. When I took the bill through the Lords, then the only areas of challenge were from certain people that wanted to link it to defence spending, other people wanted to change ICAI, the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, other people wanted to reduce the impact of what the 0.7 would be. But there wasn't any political difference. So the Labour opposition and my Conservative colleagues were for that consensus. It wasn't entirely uniform. I think we needed a private member's bill because our Conservative colleagues didn't secure enough time in the government to put the 0.7 onto a more statutory footing. But we took that opportunity and there was that consensus. And I think not only with the abolition of DFID, but also with the retreat on the 0.7 and then the rather fiscal gymnastics to try and argue that we are still committed to 0.7 as for the UK, but only when the fiscal circumstances arise, which is in many respects duplicitous, because and we come on to that, I've exposed certain areas to why that commitment was really very shallow indeed. Then I think that consensus has now been frayed, and that's been really tragic, especially when I saw early signs when UK ministers would go on international fora and they would challenge our the richest countries in the world, our fellow richest countries in the world, and say, well, we've met 0.7, what are you doing? And the way that the UK would do that, I think, I was really proud about. The early signs started to creep in after 2015 when our representatives would just be silent about that. And instead of being a champion for the richest nations to meet 0.7, silence started. So the signal started to, in my mind, started to appear quite early. And I think the retreat from, in many respects, what UK leadership could be with a small L, I think has been tragic.
And I want to pick up on this point about political consensus, and as you say, that has frayed, certainly. Minister Andrew Mitchell has said that in the course of developing the white paper that will be published, I think, in 2 months' time, that he'll be reaching out and that he wants this to be a cross-party consensus. I'd be interested in whether you agree that it should be, and can you tell us about what in practice that has meant in terms of the government or Andrew reaching out to you directly?
So I've written a very long letter to Andrew Mitchell about this, 6-page letter, outlining where if the white paper process is to be meaningful, where I believe my party is arguing for this to be impactful and meaningful. I think without the white paper addressing the fundamentals, like the means of delivery of some of our development ambitions, plus at scale with the figures that we believe that there should be with the restoration of 0.7, then I would question the impactfulness of a white paper, given the fact that we still have the refresh of the integrated review. We're still told that the development strategy is extant. So what that status has, given the fact that white papers normally are the precursor for legislation, and they've said there's going to be no legislation, then I'm not sure what it will then achieve, other than perhaps correct some elements of some of the deficiencies in the previous strategy from Liz Truss. Now that may be a low bar, I accept, but we've engaged. I don't think it will be a cross-party white paper. It certainly, as far as what I've said, is from my party's point of view, and we have a pre-manifesto document which is going to our party conference at the weekend, which is very clear of the immediate restoration of 0.7, not simply a restatement of a target, a restatement of 0.7 immediately in the formation of the next government. An independent development department, not simply a recreation of the DFID in its previous form, but an independent department with a Secretary of State and fully functioning, transparency returned, with an absolute laser focus on transition towards zero poverty and zero carbon, and the restoration of the tragic cuts on education, on women's economic empowerment, women's equality, water and sanitary health. There's a whole list of areas. Unless it achieves those, I don't think it's going to have the meaningful impact. And if Andrew Mitchell wants this to be a white paper that will survive a general election and a new government, I can to some extent admire the ambition for that, but I don't think it's going to work, and I don't think any incoming government will want to be bound by, frankly, a government which has retreated from many of the promises that they had made.
Yeah, very interesting. I think it's interesting to, will the government say, there were mistakes made in previous strategies and we are going to correct them, or will they say this just builds, it's an evolution, and I'm interested to see that, because I think there are certainly things particularly in the development strategy, just over a year ago that I don't think should be retained, and it would be good to see that challenged directly. So you've taken us on perfectly to what the Liberal Democrats' policy will be coming into the election and at conference. But so just before we get into those questions, I've already got some forming in my mind about those policies. But can you just tell us about the process of Liberal Democrat policy formation? Because it is, as the name suggests, democratic, as I understand it, and you do need to seek approval at conference for policies. So Can you just tell us where you are in that process, what that will look like in terms of a document and strategy, and whether there'll be votes at the conference, and then we'll come into what those policies are and how you might implement them.
Well, the great joy and sometimes headache of my party is that it is democratic, but we have I think one of the things to to stress is that we don't start any new election on when it comes to development policy with a year zero approach. Obviously, everything has to be updated, and we're always looking to the future. But for one illustration is that when I was taking through the 2015 bill through the Lords, I said that it was a great pleasure as a Liberal to be implementing a manifesto commitment, and that manifesto commitment was from 1970. So we've had meeting the Pearson, well, it was actually 1% in 1970, meeting the Pearson Committee recommendations, but we have had the commitment for 0.7 for 60 years. So this is not new to us. But we use the basis of, we have a Federal International Relations Committee, which is very active. We have a network of Liberals who, you'll be embarrassed me saying, but Sir Miles Wickstead, who's the Lib Dems in development. There's a very active network of Liberals who are engaged working with parliamentarians and with policy formation. So that comes to it. We've had a pre-manifesto paper that's been released, a fair deal for all. That will be debated, and then we will take that forward to the next manifesto process, and it goes to the Federal Policy Committee, and then the Parliament, and then the conference endorses it. So as we saw within the previous coalition, then certain aspects are then implemented that we had in our manifesto. So that's the process that we have.
Very interesting. And so let's start with the headline 0.7 commitment that you mentioned, and that you're clearly optimistic will make it into the manifesto, based on that kind of heritage of internationalism that the Liberal Democrats have. So you said it would be immediate. How do you envisage that working? I think we're at something like £12 billion of the aid budget now, and it would obviously increase to something like 16 or 17 billion. So if you form part of the next government, in practice, how does that work?
Yes, I'm more than optimistic, by the way. I'm absolutely certain, beyond peradventure, it will be in that commitment, which is a rock solid commitment. And I think if you want to compare us with the other parties at the moment, with the Labour Party adopting the Conservative Party's language of retaining or of regaining 0.7 when the fiscal circumstances align, you'll see a difference between us and the other parties now on that. But it does present the means by which we then have to be quite transparent as to how we would then restore the 0.7. So that inevitably any new government is going to have its spending review process. And as you said, the figures are quite obvious as what they would be. There's an element of inheriting what the previous spending review had indicated, which is an unallocated commitment, which the government had put in for meeting 0.7 by 25-26. But there's a number of replenishments that are coming up in 2024 that we need to see with the Gavi replenishment. There are areas of expenditure on some of the multilateral funds which we know that can be effectively pump-primed with early commitments that then can be seen to be delivered through the duration of that. We would certainly want to see the immediate restoration of some of the funds, as I mentioned earlier, on water and sanitary health, on women's equality and for children, for nutrition and famine relief. We would seek to replenish the humanitarian relief fund, which has been drained. My colleague Munira Wilson in the Commons asked a question last week. I will be asking a question later today on Libya. The UK's ability to respond to humanitarian crisis is now greatly diminished because the humanitarian fund has been released. So I think that we would be able to do that. Now, the only area where I think is a very fair observation is that we would not wish to create the same kind of problems in reverse that the government created when they cut so rapidly, often mid-programme, some of the schemes. So we don't want to create the reverse of that by replenishing many of these funds. But I'm very confident that is a better challenge to have than it had been to cut. So that is an opportunity. If we were in a position of in government or influencing government, then that is where we would seek to with relish, work to restore many of these areas. But I think that is absolutely doable
Yeah, no, I think you're right to be aware of the challenge of steep changes. And one of my frustrations was the asymmetry between the people that were very concerned about the money being wasted when the budget was increasing, but completely absent and making no comment when the same thing was happening with the steep cuts. So I think you're right to be aware of that. And I said to you before, this is a nice opportunity to challenge someone who's moving outside of the current mainstream in the UK on policy and to challenge you on that policy. So, on the point 7, let me put it to you that, I mean, the UK's economic growth and income per head is much lower than it was, relatively speaking, to other rich nations 10 or 15 years ago. And, I think clearly there's been a scepticism built up in the public about aid spending. So how do you see that with the continued commitment to point 7? Do you think there's public support for that return, and how would you justify it to constituents, not yourself being elected, but how would Lib Dem MPs justify it on the doorstep against the cost of living crisis that people feel?
It's a valid question, but it's one where I think, from my perspective and my party takes, we don't accept the narrative that the default position for official development assistance is unpopular, and that's not something that we've ever accepted. There's certainly a narrative against it by certain quarters, but there are narratives against many things that liberals hold very dear, so that's no surprise to us as far as that is concerned. But we also do not wish to feed that narrative from a certain quarter by legitimizing the fact that ODA is somehow default wasted, default not in our interests, default will not benefit the UK long term. There is a very good counter narrative, and that is another part of the tragic end of the consensus, that all of the political parties who then had been committed, the three major UK political parties that had been committed to this, realised that there was a degree of responsibility. If we wanted to have this position in the world, then we would communicate with our public about what the benefits for the UK would be. And that, unfortunately, I think we've seen political weakness that has defaulted back to a position to say it is better that the money is spent on you rather than them. And then we saw with COVID the extreme of that, to say effectively for vaccine discrimination, closing down flights from Nigeria when actually other parts were not, the whole gamut, the damage that we've done to the global reputation because of the way that we've treated with that. But fundamentally, I don't think there's been a massive difference because it comes down to the kind of questions you ask and when you ask it and who you ask. And therefore, you look at, on the one hand, the government saying, the public are not behind us on this one. And then you look at the public response to some of the humanitarian crises, and it's been off the scale. And not just Ukraine war, but also within floods in Pakistan, or the Turkey earthquake, or what's been happening recently in Morocco and Libya. The public's desire to help has been enormous. So I don't start from the narrative position that this is fundamentally unpopular, but it does require us to take some leadership and to explain why this is not only right, and I think you start with saying it is right, because we are in an enormously privileged position in the UK for being one of the richest countries in the world, and we have a responsibility as a global citizen, but also it is in our interests. I don't know if Cindy McCain from the World Food Programme is on the American political chat shows on Sunday morning. And she said, and it's not language that I would use, but she said, if we don't feed the people, we will be fighting the people. And it's an interesting way that the WFP put it, but it is in our interests, when you look at how global the UK is now, that we fulfill our commitments. And it's also in our diplomatic interest that we don't reduce the partnerships that you had with many of our other countries that we've been working with, than to pull up the drawbridge, often mid-program, mid-year. That has done us diplomatic harm, that it makes it harder to prosecute a case when we're seeking support for the Ukraine war, etc. So all of these things are connected.
Yeah, and it's remarkable that, if you look at the crises that have affected the UK and the cost of living, COVID, all of those have had their genesis in internationally. So I think you're right that it's a matter of leadership and connecting those issues to people's lives. So you said something there about an independent department on development, but I think you said different from DFID, and I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that and tell us how it would be different from DFID and why there's a case for that international department.
Well, I think retaining some of the elements of the leadership that DFID were able to provide on thought leadership, on the way of delivery, transparency, which we've fallen down with, and transparency was so important. But the means by which we were doing development, I think I would wish to seek to recreate. But many of the challenges of development going forward for the next 25 years are not the same as 25 years ago when DFID was established, and whether some of the challenges on the critical aspects of financing the SDGs, on the climate challenges and the climate emergency, on the way that development programs can be implemented or harmed through artificial intelligence. Enormous opportunities, incredible opportunities, but equally there are challenges. I think depressingly, I don't think there was the understanding that there would be a rapid growth in fragile and conflict-afflicted areas when DFID was established, and I think that is going to be one of the areas that's challenging. The issue to do with potential conflict on water, the displaced people, issues is at a scale bigger than it was then. But I think also our relationship with countries is different. And in my mind, and I'm having to be really conscious of the language that I use as far as not using aid, not using support, but I know it's slightly cliche, but talking about partnership and working together is really important. And in my mind, the two enormous challenges that we will be facing, that an independent Department of the Secretary of State and the UK being what I would love to be, is the premier partner for any country wishing to transition its economy and its nation to zero poverty and zero net carbon. And the way that countries transition, given all of the previous elements which are some of the obstacles to that, I think is the challenge going forward of probably the next generation of development. And I would, in my mind, an independent development department is a UK Department of Global Transition. And the UK can be seen as the go-to country that can effectively support any either emerging country or developing country to transition with all of the difficulties and problems that transition brings. And when I've had an enormous opportunity and privilege to travel to so many countries, what we take for granted in the richest countries to transition, to buffer, to have some form of financial capacity, some form of official capacity for policy development, to transition from A to B, it's hard enough in our country to do that. Look at what we're seeing with the need for massive subsidies for EV production in the UK at the moment. Well, put yourself in a country that doesn't have the kind of capacity that the UK has got, then we can become the development partner for that.
Interesting. And so let's delve into that a little bit in terms of transition. I mean, I think one of the challenges that we see for development agencies and for governments working on development is exactly the balance between those two goals of net zero poverty and reducing emissions. And work that we've done has shown the 50 poorest countries in the world, their emissions per head are probably less than half a ton, and they're not even going to get to a ton per head in the next 10 or 15 years. So their contribution to global warming and the need for them to reduce emissions on a per head basis is very limited at the moment. Obviously, there's a longer term question. So how would you balance those two goals? Because the net zero one, it feels like it's about working with middle income countries who are strongly increasing their fossil fuel use, whereas the net poverty one is working with fragile and conflict affected states with very low income per head, and those are quite different constituencies. So how would you square those two goals?
It's true. There's no doubt about that. In certain areas will be ODA, in some other areas will be UK technical support and technical partnership with middle income countries. But I don't see I don't see them as separate planets. I don't see them as separate continents that are hermetically sealed against each other. There isn't. There are the way that I'll be potentially traveling to Asia in a couple of weeks' time. The way of looking at economies within certain parts of Asia, for Vietnam, etc. They are many countries that are emerging, are markets to and providers to emerging economies in developing countries. So it isn't the case that the policy solutions for a middle-income country are then going to be completely separated out from what we consider to be for developing countries, developing economies. But of course, some of the policy tools that will be required will be different. And we know that as far as the availability for many countries that still rely on rural economies, on access to water, some of the technologies that the middle income countries will be for energy production, for desalination, or for all different areas as far as they'll need for their growth for their economy. There is a knowledge base and and tools and development that we can use for those countries that have the least resources for those. And I think that's where a department which can then pull in a lot of the work that would be done from, say, the UK trade department that would be looking at climate. I think we can use the UK knowledge base a lot better, I think a lot smarter, and that probably will generate more effective development policies than having the development department sit within the Foreign Office. So I think that's, and I've often questioned why we have a Minister for Development who is the Minister for Africa, rather than basically bringing some of the climate policy brief within government to be linked with the geographical brief for Africa. I think we need to think creatively as to how we support many of the countries, but not with an isolation of each other.
Right, and I want to come on to policies beyond aid, because as a community we can be too fixated on that in just a second. But just before we leave this topic, I mean, if you are thinking about the aid budget and how you allocate that between countries, and you look at how the government's doing it at the moment, obviously you're giving yourself some more headroom because you would have a bigger budget. But in terms of the share of that budget that's going to the poorest countries, would you see a government with Liberal Democrats in it increasing the share to the poorest country, keeping it about the same, or using the resources for the energy transition with a different group of countries?
Well, I think how a department strategy delivered, and I think, as I mentioned, with the absolute focus on the primary SDG goal on zero poverty, I think that has to, and this might be an area where Andrew Mitchell and I will agree on, that if that absolute focus is that, then that is the driving force behind it. I think one of the areas, so another thing I'd say by preface it, I should have mentioned it earlier, we very strongly believe that official development assistance should not be spent within the UK. So one of the things that we need to correct is the fact that for the first time in our country's history, more ODA was spent within the UK than on bilateral programs abroad. That is just wrong, and it would end if we had anything to do with it. And I've challenged ministers on this repeatedly in the Lords, including during the migration bill. So that balance between zero poverty and climate, in many aspects, I suspect, Ian, it's quite hard to untangle. But that's where the more creative discussions with World Bank and some of the MDBs come in, because it could well be, if we're doing this at scale and with others, that we see the biggest impact with doing it through the multilateral. There will be other areas that direct bilateral partnership. The problem that I've witnessed is that we seem to have gone from extreme to extreme. So we had previous strategy, which based on the Paddy Ashdown review of the support for multilaterals, which I thought had a great deal of sense behind it, and there was a rationale, and that got support. And then there was the development strategy that said, no. And ministers would say to me, and when I was asking in the chamber, the better uses of bilateral. And then we saw whole swathes of bilateral programs ending entirely. So we saw that at the same time as the government saying that we wanted to increase the number of bilaterals, then the number of bilateral programs were the smallest that we've ever seen. And now Andrew Mitchell is saying, no, bilaterals are back. So I think it's this kind of pendulum between the two, which is causing some kind of confusion. But if the white paper resolves this, all to the good.
Yeah, I think the what's happened to the bilateral budget is a great advert for multilateralism, isn't it? I mean, I think the claims to be a reliable partner are, subject to political forces.
And the thing is, when we see things that there is a pragmatic element of me when we see elements that work, then how are they scaled up, and what is the challenge then of scaling them up to see them work at impact and then elsewhere? And another alarm bells that I've seen is that you can, if the white paper, as so many aspects of the strategy says, is that every single box is ticked for every single part of development, but it is at such a minute scale that it's not going to be delivering, then that where we do have to come back to the 0.7, because there's no point in the government saying, as I often get answers to my question, we are committed to water and sanitary health, but it's at a scale that's 15% less than it would be. So the impact is going to be at a margin less. So I think it's to do with identifying what works and then what will be at scale and at impact.
So let's move a bit away from aid and spending. And as you said at the top, you've followed the trade agenda for some time. We've just published our Commitment to Development Index that puts an emphasis on the areas beyond aid, technology, migration, trade. So what would you pick out of the kind of the non-aid agenda as being something that you would look to do differently?
Well, I should declare I co-chair with a Conservative friend all-party parliamentary group on trade out of poverty. And I've spent a lot of work over the years focusing on this area as well. I co-chaired with the Nigerian Trade Minister an APPP report on trade, intra-Commonwealth trade, and looking at the opportunities that exist within the Commonwealth, which are massively underutilised, I think, as far as a Commonwealth premium would be concerned as far as trade facilitation. And I've made sure that when trade agreements or trade discussions come to Parliament, they are the debates, and I've triggered a number of debates to ensure that development and associated aspects of development, when it comes to the whole suite from labour rights through to human rights in the general terms, and also sustainability and trade facilitation, are a key element of that, because I think the opportunities for those areas are enormous and they can be complementary. But I don't buy into the argument that by reducing development assistance and focusing purely on free trade, because we're not going to see the real benefits. Free, fair and open trade, my party was formed 150 years ago because of free trade. So we are a free trade party, but we offer fair trade and open trade. And in so many different areas now, trade is about non-tariff barriers rather than tariff barriers. And the non-tariff barriers then fit into those wider areas of what our economic and trading relationship is with that country. And I think the opportunities for that are enormous. But my last question last week, I was indicating to Nick Westcott before that I asked a question as to what if the relationship with Africa, for example, the last time the British Prime Minister visited a bilateral visit to Africa was 6 years ago, and the commitment was given by Theresa May that we would be the the top G7 investor in Africa, and that was a promise that was ditched within months, and we're nowhere near that. So if we're to see trade and investment and partnerships, then we also need to scale up and to be back and to treat our partnerships with respect.
Yeah, interesting. And one of the, actually in the legislation, I can't remember if it was the 0.7 legislation itself or the Transparency Act that came with it, but there's an expectation there on the government reporting on, or requirement to report on what other government departments are doing that affects development. And at the moment, it appears as a paragraph in the FCDO report, but it could be a whole, agenda on that. So,
well, the previous trade minister, before he became chancellor and then disappeared in a puff of smoke, took pride in his department underspending on development partnership for economic, and he tweeted that he then gave money back to the Treasury to pay for weaponry for Ukraine. And it got probably quite a lot of followers from who he thought would be that audience for that. But that shows, I think, a fundamental problem when that even comes from a trade minister.
Yeah. So we've got a good flavour of the sorts of policies that you believe in and that you're confident, really confident, will be approved at a conference this weekend. So can you tell us something about the practicalities of this? And it's difficult to speculate on an election that might be, still 15 months away. But what's your sense from the party leadership about how development would be prioritised in any conversations about a coalition or and any red lines that you might have in mind for those sorts of discussions?
Well, we will fight for every vote and every seat and trying to maximise our. I think whatever happens in the next election, and I hope that there is a vastly increased number of Liberal Democrat MPs who will try our hardest to try to restore the UK reputation, but also to restore some of the political consensus for it. The Lords group will certainly do that. And whatever happens after the next election, my party will absolutely be wanting to be both an energetic advocate for many of the issues that we've been talking about, but also to ensure that it is on the political agenda. And we are not the greatest respect, we are not a think tank. We are a political party. We do wish to see the implementation of what we believe. We've been lucky in the past when we've had an opportunity, we've demonstrated that we take that. We had development ministers in Lynn Featherstone and Lindsay Northover. We've not only talked about issues, we've sought to implement what we believe, and that will not change.
Very good, very good. So let me now open up this conversation to people in the room and people online. To encourage people online, we have got a couple of questions come through already. So I'm gonna start with one of those if I may, and then come into the room. So thank you, Annie, a Lib Dem supporter, for your question. You've touched on this, Jeremy, but maybe you can elaborate. How do we, Lib Dems, get our internationalist messages strongly over to a wide audience in this challenging political climate?
That's a good question, because I think there actually is a hunger for when times are really tough in the UK. I don't believe that people then look into themselves, and I do think that even when there's tough times, people are looking to hear a voice for elsewhere. And at the time when, if you just think back, and maybe this is the answer to the question, we were right in the middle of in the by-election campaigns earlier this year, and we were absolutely in campaign mode, and we've been successful in campaign mode, and I hope we will continue to do that for the by-elections coming up. But Ed Davey took an opportunity of making a speech and writing and doing op-eds on development policy. And you might think that's counterintuitive, because if you're fighting a by-election, you're really rigid on focusing. But he took an opportunity to say, this is who we are. So if the country is starting to listen to us again, which is fantastic, and they're voting again for us in many respects, in many seats in their droves, then when we have that opening and people are willing to listen to us again, and they are having a conversation, and the voters are having a conversation with us, Ed took the decision to say, and also this is what we're about. And so I don't think there's any doubt that anybody thinks that we're not talking about sewage in rivers across the UK at the moment, and we are. But he also said, but we're also talking about international policy and development. Maybe comes back to when I wanted to get rid of Mrs. Thatcher and I'll pick up litter on the A1. That's who we are. So I think we will do more of that.
Yeah. He's not afraid to raise it. Very good, very good. So let me turn to questions here in the room. We've got a microphone, I think, and I wonder if we can ask this gentleman here to start us off. And could you introduce yourself as well, please?
Absolutely. I'm Ken Bluestone. I work with Age International. We're the international arm of Age UK, but we're also members of the Disasters Emergency Committee. We've been talking a lot about policy and here in the UK, but I want to shift our focus a little bit to the people, actually, the end result of this and whose lives we're trying to affect. You mentioned Lindsay Northover, and actually she was the minister who brought aging issues into the ministerial portfolio of DFID at the time, when the SDGs were created. I'm curious as to how that commitment to also addressing the needs and rights of older people is being taken forward in Lib Dem policy now.
Thank you, Ken. It's a good question, because I think the generational justice and looking at where we look at the demographics of many countries, then both the kind of support for those that are in the older generation in many respects, but also the opportunities that exist for many who will still have much to offer as far as economic empowerment and their rights, and especially those that will have long-term conditions, or those disabled elder people, then I think that is it should be a thread across all of the different policy areas that we have. I will see what's in the white paper about it, but the question, you would not be surprised to hear that in the House of Lords in particular, age issues come up quite a bit. Lord Fowkes and others who are passionate advocates for age justice. In my mind, I see that as an element of generational justice, and to ensure that there is not in many countries a group of the society who are somehow considered not to be part of the development opportunities that exist for them.
Thank you. So we've got another question from this gentleman here.
Thank you, Jeremy. You made a very good point that the world that we're now having to deal with is a very different one from the one that DFID was originally created to tackle the problems of, with conflict, with a whole set of different situations. And I worry that the white paper is going to look at tackling these problems purely from the UK point of view, rather than the point of view of those countries we're trying to help. So, you know, we've only got this small pot of money. How are we going to use it best for the UK's influence? The challenges we face are now absolutely enormous, and the sums required to tackle the impact of climate change across Africa and the developing world as a whole are way bigger than any development program is going to do. So we're looking increasingly at the question of leverage. So my question is whether, which you didn't mention, BII is going to be a large part of the future of British aid. Thanks.
So I'm in general terms a supporter of BII and CDC beforehand. I've been slightly concerned that there wasn't much debate before its extension and its responsibility within Ukraine, for example, and there are certain elements of the Liz Truss BII strategy that was set that our primary should be working with freedom-loving nations, without a definition of what that would be. So I'm a skeptical supporter of it. But you're absolutely right with the leverage, and I think this is where it comes into an interesting area that I've tried to engage in, certainly when I visit the Gulf and I visit other areas, that what are the DAC rules for this period as well? Now, I'm certainly not someone who will want to then either diminish or to reduce the DAC rules. I've been a champion of them, and we were talking earlier about the Migration Act and the Home Office wanting to score on change the rules to suit their political purposes. But when the UK has fallen back, what I think has tended to happen is that we've stopped, as I mentioned before, we've stopped being the advocate for meeting many of other countries raising their ambition, to now the UK spent an enormous amount of resource trying to infill gaps of our cuts. And that's not gone unnoticed. So when the UK cuts in certain areas, then the UK ministers have a discussion with the Saudi minister to say, could you infill some of this? And therefore, we've seen the effort that we should be having for leverage, and you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, we've been spending too much effort trying to infill some of the reductions, especially on famine relief, on some of the humanitarian relief. And we've certainly been asking countries to do that aren't part of the DAC network. So it's that lack of transparency at the same time as the lack of us being a tub-thumping advocate around the world, I think has been a real problem. And I would love there to be a UK member of the cabinet who spends a fair amount of time doing advocacy role around the world, and that isn't happening.
And just to pick up on the point of leverage, we published a report last week looking at non-grant efforts of the UK, and I mean, one of the takeaways there is, you know, the idea of billions to trillions, I think, is now dead, and the mobilisation ratios that you see, especially bilaterally, are quite limited. I mean, multilaterally, you can achieve ratios of 5 to 1 and maybe more with guarantees. But on guarantees, which we think are quite promising, that the transparency is really lacking.
And the really depressing. I don't know. We'll end on a point of optimism, I'm sure. But until then, one of the really things that made me so furious is that there were many programs and many activities. I come back to WASH before, where the UK was by far the biggest supporter of. And therefore, and some of these programs have not been able to be infilled by other supporters, because so even if Germany upped it, or the United States upped it, or some other areas, so those programs now are less than what they were, even when other countries have upped their kind of support. And that has been an unforgivable part, I think, of the UK, drastic cuts. And the unforgivable aspect of it is that the government knew it. So you look at the two equality impacts, they knew it. And it took Sarah Champion, who did one of these previous, it took a parliamentary committee in the United Kingdom to use parliamentary privilege to release a document on equality's impact of decisions. But now, if we're talking about leverage and trying to speak to other development leaders around the world, what lesson does that give? It gives an awful lesson. So we have to move away from that.
Let me take this moment to pose you another question from our online audience, and then I can see we've got a few questions in the room to finish on. And this maybe builds on that, which is from the Eleanor Crook Foundation, asking, what is your view on the significance of malnutrition for the future of UK development policy? And I know you've focused a lot on food insecurity with your visits in the last year. So
yes.
Would that be a particular area that you would emphasise that fits with what you've just said?
Yes, and I understand that the white paper is going to be released at an associated event, and that's absolutely right. And it's a really good question. So in my long letter to Andrew Mitchell, the restoration of nutrition support and the focus on nutrition support and that life journey of children, I think can be transformative. And I think that level of support and the restoration of support on that area will be critical. That is a key ask of us in the white paper. We hope very much that we'll see the demonstration for that. And I think that comes back to the question you asked before about reduction in poverty and also on climate. And also reduction in poverty is also about ensuring that there are life chances. And nutrition is probably one of the best things that we could do to ensure that we're not having to repeat some of these errors when the child becomes 7 or 8. And then there's issues to do with educational performance. And then there's aspects to do with human development and then stunting. We know that is a critical area, so we're very supportive.
Very good. Let's take another question in the room. If you could introduce yourself briefly.
I'm Mark Lowcock, formerly of DFID and the UN, and currently, among other things, with CGD. Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy, for coming here to CGD to deliver such a powerful, compelling, clear and encouraging message. I'd be amazed if there's enormous disagreement with anything that you've said in this community. Probably most of the questions are on things that you haven't had a chance to say yet. So let me add another one of those, which relates to the Lib Dems' historic leadership on issues of rights, human rights. And as we know, around the world, rights are being rolled back in many countries, especially poorer countries, especially for women and girls. So could you also confirm that one of the other priorities of the new Secretary of State and the new department will be to invest in organisations which help defend rights, everything from anti-corruption organisations to parliaments to the free media to groups which lobby on particular issues to groups which stand up for minority groups? Because in the past, the FID did do some work on that, but a lot of the efforts were not sufficiently successful. And that's one of the big challenges we face in this era of autocrats.
It wouldn't do your question, Mark, justice if I simply said yes, 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 yes. You're absolutely right. So I declare an interim. I chair the UK board for Search for Common Ground on peace building. I'm an associate with Global Partners Governments that focuses on representative institutions. I spend quite a lot of my time in this area, which I'm really passionate about. All of those areas, and every time that we've had debates, and I mentioned earlier, triggering some debates on some of the trade agreements, of looking at why the UK is not replicating the successor to the Cotonou Agreement, why we don't have a human rights and trade policy in the UK, and now the new trade ministers are saying that effectively this is Christmas tree decorations on trade, on human rights and labour rights, and these are fundamentally important. As you know, as an absolute expert in this area with a great track record, it's very often hard to prove the counter when these areas work, and therefore they're quite easy to cut because it's not like the nutrition but they are so fundamental. And given the challenges of the next generation and the growth in those fragile and conflict-afflicted areas, and the likelihood of other areas falling into that, then these areas are so fundamental, and they absolutely will be a thread that goes throughout it. And it isn't the case of a country like the UK wanting to dictate on other countries or determine, because those elements are universal commitments, and often the case, it's working with countries to deliver what they had signed up to with us. And fundamentally, economies perform better if, on a trade aspect, if there are human rights, if there's transparency, if there are functioning parliamentary democracies. All of these are significant contributors to the performance of the economy. So I absolutely support it without doubt.
Thank you. I'm just going to come over here to one more question here, and I see we've got two more questions in the room. So let's try and get through
I'll be shorter.
all of them. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you very much, Rob Merrick from DevEx. Nice to see you. Can I ask you this, perhaps? Andrew Mitchell has made it his mission, of course, to try to clear up the mess he acknowledges he inherited because of the cuts and the merger. I wonder, from your vantage point at the nice end of Parliament, how much do you think he is succeeding in that, and what or who are the obstacles to doing so?
Well, I'm very old-fashioned. I think if you're having a fundamental change of government policy, which certain elements have said that Andrew Mitchell's wanting to do, I think it's better to allow the public to decide in an election, because it's been a bit confusing for me of trying to hold the government to account for the development strategy, and they say it's working, and then there's a refresh of it and they say, oh, actually we're correcting this, and now there's going to be a white paper that basically is saying everything that they would do, or many aspects they were doing, they acknowledged that there were some errors in how they do it. When I've been trying to hold ministers to account for that, it would be quite good if I think we do need an election and we need to reset. And I think there needs to be some transparency in the way they're delivering these processes. And I can only repeat, Rob, what I said before. If this process is to be meaningful, it needs to go back to the fundamentals as to why it's not working. And simply tweaking is not going to be sufficient. And even with the best will in the world, this could be an improvement on the administration of the government's policy, but it's the policy that needs to change.
Very good. Question here.
Hi, I'm Ronald Snack, Senior Fellow at the Centre for Global Development. I also used to work at DFID for about a decade. So one of the things that partly was driven by, I guess, the 0.7% legislation, but more generally over the last decade or two, in the UK, development policy has always felt very compartmentalised, sort of run by the development department. In recent years, obsessed about with the spending function in development policy. How would you see a Lib Dem? How do you think government in which Lib Dem is involved could make development policy something that the whole of government thinks about, rather than just is about where we spend, how we spend?
Yeah, and I've been very conscious that as an advocate, and certainly within Parliament, I've taken every single opportunity to be looking at not only the cuts and the scale of the cuts. I've also been very conscious of the fact that the answer can come back simply, it's not just about the money. A lot of the time, the reason why I ask about the money is because the money was there for a purpose. And that's why we have well thought out, and I'm not just saying it because you were differed and Mark, I'm not just saying it to flatter people, but I'm a politician, so allow me to flatter you a little bit, is that the fact that the UK had done an enormous amount of work on research and development, on thought leadership, and those areas have been wiped out. So we have shaped how many of the MDBs, we've shaped how many of those areas. So I would love to recreate that too as part of it. And I think that's helped if there is a distinct department. And and that's why I'm also keen to say is that we're simply not recreating. And so I've told that we used, before DFID was abolished, we were told that there was one HMG, there was one government, ambassadors and high commissioners would have a beefed up role for that. We've gone through a number of different iterations. The fundamental aspect for me, I think, is having a Secretary of State who's got the capacity and the authority and the freedom after the allocation has been provided to give that departmental lead. And as I indicated before, as being the primary transition partner, you draw in officials from, and there could be some, used to be some fantastic work that would be done with the Enterprise Department on climate research, and then the Rural Department. And officials from other Whitehall departments, in my experience, loved the fact that they were also part of a development agenda. And I would love to create that feeling within government that it is a one government approach, but that I don't see that happening at the moment. So that's what I would love to establish again.
Great. Well, we're running up against time, so let me.
Was that optimistic enough to leave?
Yeah,
that?
I think so. I think
Okay,
so.
right.
I mean, we've turned around. I mean, it's been actually really good to talk about a progressive policy agenda and to challenge some of the, and to discuss where the UK might do more on development instead of, as you say, the conversation can be quite negative. So thank you very much for coming and for championing development in the House of Lords and in this conversation today, and with your Lib Dem colleagues. We really look forward to continuing that conversation, seeing where you get to at conference on policy, and maybe seeing where it ends up in government the next time around. So thank you for taking the time to come and set this out. Thank you also to my colleagues that have helped organise this, particularly Maya, Nicole and Sam, who've put a lot of effort in behind the scenes to get this right, but also to everyone who has helped on the day. And look out for the next one of our series to be confirmed, but our next series of political thinkers coming up soon.
Thank you
again.
Thank you.